right. Hi, everyone. It is June 16th, 2019, and this is episode 184 of At Percussion. This is Karli Vigna, and with me today are co-hosts Casey Cangelosi. Hi, Casey.
Hey everyone, how's it going?
And Ben Charles.
Hi, everybody.
So, guys, how are your summers going so far?
I have a terrible cold.
Still?
Still? Oh crap, did I have this before? Yeah, I guess still.
Last week, I think you were talking about those daycare illnesses.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, that's right. We were talking about that. Yeah, it's the worst. So it's getting better.
I missed some good information. I'm I'm having a great summer. I just saw Paul McCartney 2 days ago in Dallas. It was Arlington, technically. It was awesome.
I feel like you saw Paul McCartney already on this podcast before.
Maybe I've seen him twice, and the other two times were like 3 or 4 years ago, like 14, 15, something like that.
Wow. If I had to guess, I would have said you've seen Paul McCartney 2 or 3 times every year since I've known you. That's what it feels like.
Probably just brings it up a lot.
I think he brings it up a lot. How was it?
It was awesome. The best tune was "Live and Let Die." I've never seen him perform in an outdoor venue, and so this is like a baseball stadium. So they had like fireworks. They always have pyrotechnics, but they had fireworks going off this time. So yeah, I put a video on Facebook. Check it out. It's pretty cool.
Paul McCartney, he's that guy from the Rolling Stones, right?
No, he was in Led Zeppelin.
That's what I thought.
The drummer.
Yeah, good thing we're all music teachers.
Yeah, perfect. So our guest today is percussionist Ashley Baier, who happened to have been my classmate back in our University of Maryland days. Ashley has performed with a variety of orchestras, chamber groups, and artists, including Pitch Black Brass Band, Pharaoh Monch, and John Hodgman. She has played numerous New York City music theater productions and has toured nationally with How the Grinch Stole Christmas and also 100 Days, which I got to see back in April when you were here in Miami. So welcome to the show, Ashley. It's so great to have you on.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here. It's my first ever attempt at podcasting. So hopefully my years of being an avid podcast listener will pay off.
I'm sure. Well, Ashley, do you want to start by telling us a bit about what you've been up to these past few years?
Sure. So the past few years, I've kind of gone through a little bit of a professional change musically. When I first finished graduate school in 2009, I was primarily playing with touring pop and hip hop bands. The most notable being Pitch Black Brass Band, which I played with for almost 6 years. And for a multitude of reasons, that project kind of ran its course, which I was a little bummed about at the time, but it sort of became a blessing in disguise because I realized that with so much free time not traveling, touring with a pop band, I was able to recommit myself to performing musical theater. So since that band dispersed in 2017, I think, I've been playing a lot more musicals, both in New York and on the road. And that's still what I'm doing today.
Cool. One of the things I wanted to ask you about, actually, back at Maryland, I knew you mostly as a concert percussionist, and now you're doing, it seems like, a lot of drum set playing, a lot of musicals and stuff. So I wanted to know, were you ever pressured by anyone to choose one or the other, or what has your experience been balancing the different worlds?
I wouldn't say that I was ever pressured to make a choice. I will say that really since middle school, I've had an interest in playing musical theater. And I was lucky enough to be from a pretty small town where I was able to play professionally at a young age. And those professional gigs were mostly at an equity theater, Cumberland Theater. So I've always had that as my main interest. But I was studying with a teacher, Ronald Horner, who you guys may know as the author of The Tuneful Timpanist. And he was an amazing classical teacher. We did very little drum set, but he always encouraged me to keep playing drum set, which I did. So through high school, I was playing in rock bands. I was in the jazz band at school, just kind of trying to do as much variety of percussion making as possible. And I did go to Maryland as a classical major, but while I was there, I also played in the big band for 2 years, a jazz combo for 2 years, and in addition to studying with John Tafoya, I studied drum set lessons with Tony Martucci, who at the time was the head of the jazz department or the percussion department at Maryland.
Cool, cool. Do you have any advice for students who are kind of having one foot in the drum set world and one foot in the concert percussion world?
If that's your passion to do both, I would say to do it. I don't think anybody should limit themselves, especially percussion. You have, I think more so than any other instrument, you have the opportunity to perform in both classical and contemporary styles. So it was always important to me to take what I'm learning from a classical position, something like dynamics or playing to the size of the room, and bring that into a drum set world where typically people think drum set, they think loud rock music. And that is, as you guys know, not always what should be played, especially like in a smaller venue. So I would say try to keep both up. Try to find a teacher that encourages you to be expansive in your knowledge of percussion.
Yeah, I think that's good. It's something I always try to tell my own students. And there's no real hard cut like answer for everybody, you know. But I think what you said is good. If you're passionate about both, keep doing both. And in the world, all the different worlds of percussion are not as far away as we think they might be. You know, it's all music, like you said. Everything has dynamics. Everything has nuance and phrasing.
Exactly.
Cool.
Yeah.
Ben, I think you have something.
Yeah, Ashley, I was checking out your website earlier today. I was enjoying checking out some of your videos performing like the Broadway pits. It's always fascinating, like the amount of page turns and watching and looking around and playing tempo blocks and all this other stuff you have to do. And I had a follow-up question that you kind of touched on half of it, but I find it really refreshing to hear someone that wants, like, legitimately wants to do drum set and classical, if we were to break it down like that. And many of my students, and probably definitely in fact me when I was 18 years old, only want to play like one thing, only want to be a marimba soloist, or only want to play timpani and orchestra. And so I was wondering, you sort of touched on, like, as a drum set player going into classical music, you can, certainly draw on your drum set knowledge to get into classical music. But why do you think that classical performers should also study drum set?
Well, I think as like a student of classical music, you kind of get into the habit of shedding on your own, practicing excerpts by yourself. And when I was like in college, of course you get to play in various ensembles, but you're not really, as a percussionist, you're not really making music with other people a lot. And I found with playing drum set, you do have the opportunity to play with other people. And as we can get into later, playing with, working with, being around other people is what part of the reason that you're going to work in the future. I also think, obviously, that playing drum set is a really good way to work on your time, which can be important in a classical setting. Though I think not just drummers are responsible for time. I think every musician should work on time. But that's an important part of drum set playing. Playing with the metronome, playing quietly, playing loudly, taking the rudiments that you maybe learned with your marching program, applying to the drum set, applying them to other percussion instruments.
Casey, I think you had something.
I did. Well, after years of doing this podcast, we often see, like, y'all's teacher, John Tafoya, for example, just an episode or two ago, it's like we think of him like he is a classical timpanist, but we discovered he has a violin background. And it's like, what I've discovered is the norm is no one is just a drum set player. No one is just a classical percussionist. Like, I'm yet to meet someone who you say, like, tell me all about your musical upbringing and background. And they say, like, oh yeah, basically I just rammed Porgy and Bess my whole life, and that's how I arrived at my gig, and I don't know what a hi-hat is. Like, we just haven't met that person yet, whether it's a marimbist, a classical musician or a drum set artist. And I think it's very easy as a young person to look at, a killer drummer like Thomas Lang or something and be like, well, yeah, like the only way to get that good is to only do that. That's like the only possible way. And that might be true to get that good, but you'd be so surprised how many amazing proficient how many drum set players out there are also classical. Like Ashley is clearly one of them, there's plenty of them that are very, very good at many things.
Right. Yeah, Tafoya is a good example. I mean, yes, he also played violin. He's also an amazing jazz vibraphone player. One of my teachers at Manus, Michael Warner, who's principal at Seattle, when I was studying with him, he was at Metropolitan Opera. Obviously, he's an amazing classical percussionist, but he is a killer jazz drum set player. So for me, I've known for a very long time that I'm not going to be the best timpanist. I'm not going to be the best virtuosic drum set player, but I want to be the best I can at any type of musical situation. So if someone says, hey, we need you to play like this jazz cocktail gig, can you do it? Yes. If someone wants you to play a vibraphone cocktail hour, can you do it? Yes. Can you do both? Yes. So yeah, I think it's just important to keep an open mind. Don't get bogged down thinking about just playing four-mallet marimba, because when you finish school, you realize there's no way you're ever going to be able to just play four-mallet marimba if you want to make a gig or make a professional career out of music, for the most part.
Like most people think of Ben as this virtuoso percussionist. They don't know he's also a bodybuilder.
Oh wow! Let's see some flexes here.
See those guns, man.
Not true.
I really didn't know where you were going with that, Casey.
Oh yeah, dude, Ben.
Gone far worse directions, I suppose. But well, actually, I had a question. It reminds me. I heard John Parks when I was a senior in high school gave a clinic, and he talked about, actually I think a junior in high school, but anyway, John Parks talked about a lot of what you're talking about with like you've got to be able to say yes to every gig. And it was funny hearing John say like, okay, like there's a little caveat, like if someone asked me to play tabla at like an Iranian dinner party, like probably not happening.
Right.
And I'm sure in New York there have been some gigs where you just said, I'm sorry, I don't think I can take that hammered dulcimer gig or whatever. Have you had any of those or heard of any of those?
I've heard of similar situations. One example that comes to mind is last weekend I was hired to play a recording session for music that's going to be played for a Jewish kids music class. And it was mostly drum set, so fine, simple. But there was also some doumbek playing, which I understand how the instrument works. I can fake it enough for this recording session, but by no means like a traditional professional doumbek player. But I borrowed an instrument for someone because it's something I don't even have. And I practiced it for a few days, well enough to play on this particular session. And I think it went fine, but I'm sure if I was playing like a Turkish gala or something, I think I would be called out for my inaptitude at the instrument. But I think I would pass that gig on to the appropriate person.
Yeah, Casey, I think you have something.
I was going to ask just a little bit about New York, because we've had guests on the show before that are working in New York or have left New York. And I don't know if you all have ever had students or young folks ask you about like, well, I want to make it, I want to break in, I should probably like move to New York City, right? That's where everything happens.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt, but we actually distinctly had one guest say like, if you want to do music, get the hell out of New York.
I know. I know. Well, that's the other thing, and I've had friends who like, I moved from Boston to Houston and then to like the middle of nowhere, and like I got a lot more done in the middle of nowhere than I did in Boston or Houston. And Boston and Houston were great, but I got a lot more done in those places. And I've had friends who I've kind of talked them through moving from their big city activity and all the things they were doing to more remote places, and just to kind of say, well, it'll be okay. The ways you're going to work are these other ways, and it's cool you're moving to this smaller place for, some specific job. So yeah, I don't know. I would just love to hear your thoughts, because clearly you've achieved something really great. And something else I want to ask you about is like breaking in, because I mean breaking in is so difficult, especially in a really saturated place, as people tell us.
Right. So since I was probably 12 or 13, I knew I wanted to live in New York City and I wanted to make music there. So I decided after I finished my undergrad at Maryland, I wanted to go right into grad school, and I wanted to do it in New York because that's where I wanted to live and work professionally. So I used graduate school as an excuse, a very expensive excuse, to move to New York. And it's true that there is so much music here, every genre. I mean, not just classical music or jazz, like Turkish music. There's just a variety. You could play any style of music here and people wouldn't bat an eye. But obviously there are a ton of percussionists here. There's the best in the world, and then there's just amateurs who can still get a gig at like a random bar any night of the week. But as I've spent a lot of time playing music on tour in different cities, I've come to realize that there's amazing music happening everywhere in the world. I was particularly impressed when I was in Miami, just like the amount of Cuban music that was there, new contemporary music, theater scene, and you find amazing musicians and amazing music being made everywhere. So I don't think, I personally no longer feel like I'm not going to be successful unless I make it in New York. I think you can be successful anywhere. And I also think living in a city is extremely challenging, like not just musically, but something like grocery shopping takes like massive coordination, and just like, how many bags can I carry 6 blocks from the grocery store to my house? Like, it's definitely not for everybody. You have to have a lot of energy, and you have to be very focused, because it's very easy to be distracted by seeing music every night, going out to bars every night, hanging out with 5 different groups of people every night. So that doesn't really work for everybody. And I don't think that is like a personal flaw. I just don't think New York is quite the right fit. And I don't think that's really a problem.
Right, you just have to enjoy it. It just has to be something you enjoy, right?
It has to be something that you enjoy. I think as much as it's important to me to like be a professional music maker, but it's really important for me to be happy. And if I was playing here on Broadway every night, but like completely miserable, I mean, what's the point of living your life that way?
Of course. It's very hard taking your cat to the vet in Boston.
Yeah, it's. I have a cat. We went to the vet a few months ago, and it wasn't pretty.
Like, all jokes aside, like, how do you just take it on the subway, or like
Take it on the subway, cat carrier. It's not that hard.
Getting her in the carrier was the biggest issue, and then we took a cab, and she just it wasn't pretty.
So our cat, we moved from West Virginia here to Harrisonburg, Virginia, and our cat's just terrible in the carrier. Let her out, let her roam around the car. She sits right here on my shoulder while I drive, and like kind of growls, and it's not pleasant. Or you worry like, oh man, she could lose it any second, and we could crash.
Yeah, dangerous.
Well, Ashley, in addition to all the work you're doing in New York City, you spent a decent amount of time touring, both with bands like Pitch Black and also with a musical. Would you talk a little bit about what touring life is like and maybe some of the differences between the two types of tours?
Yeah, sure. So with Pitch Black Brass Band, we spent a fair amount of time traveling while playing. Occasionally we would go on like 2 or 3 week runs, either like in the Northeast or down south or on the West Coast. We never really were out for more than that, though, like never like months at a time, which I think if the band was still playing together, that's probably where we'd be today out of necessity. It's like you make, for a pop band these days, you're making most of your money playing shows. And then for 3 years, I've done the Broadway tour for How the Grinch Stole Christmas, which is an awesome percussion book. It's a combined percussion drum set book, so an hour and a half of nonstop playing, basically. And then this year, the show Karli had mentioned earlier, 100 Days, we were in San Diego at La Jolla Playhouse for 2 months in the fall. And then we were in Florida basically from January through April this year. So this year I spent a lot of time, basically September through April on the road with 100 Days, Grinch, back to 100 Days. And it's very different touring with like a professional theater company versus like a rock band where you're kind of doing it yourself and, you know, maybe staying in a hotel once a week, but probably staying at a friend's house for the other 6 days, versus being on tour with a musical where they put you up in great housing, they book all your travel for you. They just make it as easy as possible to show up and do your job. So both gigs like have their perks. Touring with a rock band, it seems like you get to like interact with local people that are either in the audience or just like hanging out around the venue. The one thing with that is usually those shows are late at night. So a lot of times you're not starting a set until 10 o'clock. You're finishing your show at 1 a.m. You're loading out. You get back to the hotel or wherever you're staying at 3. You have to wake up at 8 o'clock to be in the van to drive 6 hours to the other gig. So that can be very exhausting. And with Pitch Black, something we realized, it took a little bit of time, but we soon realized that just because, like, you know, in addition to whatever door deal that you take home for payment, like you get like a free case of beer every night, doesn't mean you need to drink the beer every night. You know what I mean? Because like you're playing these shows like 5 club dates in a row. Like you can't be partying every night. You have to like still be a responsible musician, do a great job at work, try to get as much sleep as possible, and take care of yourself. So it's important to also eat healthy when you're on the road. Even if you don't have a lot of time, try to stop at a Whole Foods for lunch instead of going to McDonald's or something. So that's all stuff I learned kind of with experience. It wasn't really something I thought about until it was happening. Luckily with theater, they take care of you with either catering or, you know, they'll send you something called a city sheet, which has like a bunch of restaurants in every town and directions to the venue, where the nearest hospital is. Like they just have all these documents for you that kind of helps prepare you, so you're not having to do so much research on your own, which is really nice.
Wow, yeah, stuff I would have never thought of. Yeah, I've always heard touring described as like you're very still until suddenly you got to go. Then you got to go hard, and then you have all this. You may have this big block of downtime, and then you got to go really hard, stop, go all the time.
Ashley,
Right. I mean, there's definitely some downtime, especially when you're traveling, if you're spending like 6 hours in the van, you have a lot of downtime, but it's really up to you to be proactive about that downtime. So maybe during those 6 hours, you could write some new music or just check out some drum videos to get some new ideas. Just try to be productive and not just waste the day away sleeping or watching like Instagram videos or something.
Sure. Ben, I think you have something.
Yeah, actually, I had a question. I know that going along with the Broadway stuff, one big thing is subbing, which to sub in like a, even if it's a big part, like if you were to sub as a timpanist in a Beethoven symphony, there's a pretty good reference point as to what to do, and we've all probably studied that. And the one Broadway show that I always think of in like terms of like Broadway show percussion books is Wicked, and I can't remember the guy's name, but I know the guy that plays Wicked in New York has played it a billion times, and he's in his own room, and he has a camera, and there's like a YouTube video about it. And I can't imagine stepping in to try and fill in his shoes for one show for Wicked. Like, how would you even prepare for that? So have you done like any Broadway subbing, and could you tell us about your preparation process for that?
Yeah, so actually right now I'm working on the book for Be More Chill, which is a Broadway show. And so the process with that, first, last week, I went to watch the drummer, Marcus Walls, play the show, and just kind of chat with him, see what his setup looks like. One thing about subbing that I never really thought of until I started subbing was you can't move everybody's equipment. So Marcus has a very different drum set like setup than I would. Like his cymbals are very high, for example, and he sits really low. So I'm kind of like, all right, how is my body, which is completely different than his body, gonna like work with this? So I'm kind of like taking mental pictures about how I should change my setup when I'm practicing to best match his. So I watched him play the show. He sent me the music. And for the last few days, I've basically been going through a recording that he made that's his mixer feed. So I can clearly hear the drums. I can hear the click track. I can hear the music director when she's speaking. And I'm like obsessively, like measure by measure, writing what Mark is playing versus what is in the written music. And the written music is good, especially like for most theater standards. Like it's very well written. The arranger, Charlie, is a literal genius. So his music is detailed, but Mark has a lot of nuance in his playing. So I'm making notes about, dynamics, extra snare hits, crossing out bass drum patterns and writing what he's actually playing. And I'm doing all of that before I even start hitting the drums, basically. So today I finished writing through Act 1 at home, and then I went to my studio and worked everything out, listening to his recording, playing along with it. And then I have a different, I have a video that's a conductor camera. So after I'm playing along with Marcus, now I'm going back and I'm watching how the MD conducts the show. And it's nice because on that camera, you can't really hear the drums. So I'm able to understand how I better fit in with the rest of the band than I can with just Marcus's feed. Excuse me. So I just did the same process with a show called The Lightning Thief, which, Ben, you said you're in Dallas? I was there. I was there at the end of May subbing on The Lightning Thief at the Winspear Opera House. So I did this same process with that show. And it's a little nerve-wracking going into like a sub situation, but you have to try to remain calm. Thankfully for me, I'd played at the Winspear Opera House before. So like I didn't have the anxiety that comes with like showing up to a new venue and finding the stage door, finding the stage, finding my dressing room. So that kept me calm. The band at Lightning Thief was all super nice. I had played with the bass player before. The lead actress in the show was my drum student. So all these things just like take away a lot of the mental game that I think we get into, not just with subbing, but with just music in general. You find that a lot of the stress is like not actually related to like the part. So for Lightning Thief, I had watched the drummer Jeff play the show once before. I had his drum cam. I familiarized myself with like his quirks. So for example, like again with that show, the drum part was very well written, but Jeff is the kind of person who will always play time with his foot on the hi-hat. So I knew if there's like a ride groove happening that my foot has to be going. And now with Mark playing Be More Chill, I realize every time that there's like a drag written, he plays it really open. So I'm trying to like change the way that I would play something personally to play it the way that they would, because the goal is for no one in the band, no one on stage, no one in the audience, none of the crew. You don't want anybody to realize that there's a different drummer. So yeah, it's I think to help with something like that, it's really good to practice transcribing music. So I would say like if you're interested in subbing on a show, even if you don't have the part, like maybe try to find the cast recording for Wicked. And if you don't have the percussion book, try to your best ability to write down what the percussionist is playing. Wicked might be an extreme example because it's a pretty difficult show, but starting with something easy, just like if you've never transcribed music before, maybe start with something from like a simple 60s rock song and do it to the best of your abilities. And hopefully you have a teacher or a colleague that you can take your transcription to and say, hey, does this look right to you? Does this sound right to you? I think that's a good way to start.
This is all such great stuff. There are so many moments on this podcast when I think like, oh, I wish all students everywhere were listening to this right now. Things that you just want students to hear. It's so cool.
Wait, they're not all listening to this?
I've been thinking about having like quizzes for my students on like, hey, did you hear the podcast last week? Answer this question. I'm always encouraging them.
Well, I think one thing like with students is the things that you instill in them now, they may not internalize until years down. Like as much as I heard in high school or college that you should record yourself playing, I never really did that until like the last few years. I'm like, oh my gosh, like if I would have recorded all those excerpts when I'm practicing them, I would have immediately seen or heard what was going wrong. Why didn't I do that? My teachers have been telling me this forever. So I don't think it's like a pedagogical problem. I think it just like takes a lot of time for people to internalize what you're saying.
Yeah, sometimes we're just not
ready. But listen
ready.
to your teachers. Like they know. They've been there. Yeah.
Well, I can't tell you how many times like you see either I'm sure it's all happened to us as students, like somebody else tells us the same thing our teacher's been telling us all along, and all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, I never thought of that. Or we see
Totally.
it that happens to students when they go to a master class and you're like, see, I'm glad that person is telling you this. I've been telling you for a year.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, this is a good time to transition. I have prepared a segment on Teacher Appreciation Week that we'll get to this week.
Oh, okay.
A little while back, we all celebrated Teacher Appreciation Week, or at least we saw a lot of social media posts about people and their teachers. And Teacher Appreciation Week really made me reflect on the teachers that I had the privilege of working with when I was a student, and also think about what I try to do to have the biggest impact on my students and both their musical and personal development. So while I was thinking about this, researching and reflecting, I came across an article on the NAFME website, the National Association for Music Education. And the article is called What Makes a Great Music Teacher? And there were so many good points in this. I just want to share it with all of you. The article was by Tony Masoki, who is a trombonist and also the associate director of the School of Music at Montclair State University in New Jersey. And the article basically lists 8 different characteristics of great music teachers. A couple weeks back, we also asked our listeners to share some of their thoughts on effective teaching and great teachers. And some of the notes that we got from listeners just aligned really perfectly with the characteristics in this article. So that was cool. The first characteristic of what makes a great music teacher is that great teachers connect to their students on an emotional level. This, of course, creates a relationship and trust between the teacher and student, and that's so important before any of the learning can happen. And our past guest, Brandon Arve, wrote to us that he makes the curriculum secondary to the actual needs of the student. He says you can't get to the curriculum if there's other stuff in the way. So I thought that was a great comment from Brandon. The second characteristic is that great teachers don't look to make everyone feel warm and fuzzy all the time. And we all know sometimes we have to tell students things that they don't want to hear because they're the things that they need to hear, right? And we had a comment from Alan Lang, who wrote to us about this this professor at Concord University. I don't know who it could be. Back in the day, he wrote that he wrote that sometimes he felt defeated or not good enough to be a music major. But later he was doing the work that his teacher was asking of him and found out that he was, really improving a lot because of that push that he was getting. So that was a nice thing to hear about our very own Casey.
Oh, thanks, Big Al. He sorted you out. Big Al, everybody.
The next characteristic about effective teachers is that effective teachers are great communicators of knowledge. And a lot of times I think in percussion that means explaining things in different ways, like musically and technically, and just approaching problems from different angles. And Jade Hales wrote about his teacher, Matthew Keown, former teacher, I think, that Matthew was always excellent at approaching concepts and problems from different angles. If I wasn't grasping 2 heights or something like that, he would make a small etude demonstrating the concept from a basic level and then work the problem into that etude. Or if that didn't work, he would try explaining it through physics or technical nuance. And he says, approaching student issues with multiple plans of action is what made Matt such a valuable instructor to me, and it's something I try to reproduce now that I teach privately. The next characteristic is that great music teachers love fundamentals and know how to sell them to their students. And this is a biggie. This is something I always try to do with my students, the younger ones, and also college students too, is we have rudiment challenges where they have to check off rudiments at certain tempos, and scale challenges like getting ready for the all-state auditions. So it's good. Sometimes stick control is not the most fun thing in the world, and you have to do other things to make it fun. The next characteristic is that being scared of your teacher once in a while is not the worst thing in the world. And of course, we don't mean that students shouldn't feel safe, but in the context of always feeling like a little on edge, like you really want to be prepared and make a good impression, that's super important. Another characteristic is that great music teachers understand that every single child is capable of becoming proficient at their craft. And this is a big one for me. Thinking about, some students when they're younger or in high school aren't necessarily exposed to the same instruction or the same, just kind of having knowledge of percussion before they get to college. But that doesn't mean that those students can't achieve great things when they do have access to the instruction and knowledge. The next characteristic is that great teachers render themselves useless. And I love this one, because you want to teach students to ultimately teach themselves and make their own musical decisions, much to the frustration of many of my students when they say, can you just play this for me so I know how it goes? And I never do that. I hate doing that because they need to be able to figure it out. The last one in this article is that self-reflection is a requirement of great teaching. And of course, we know we're always, as musicians and teachers, always looking for ways to improve and new methods and new materials and new repertoire and everything. And summer is such a great time for that. So it's been good. I have two things that personally that I want to add to this list. And that is that I think the teachers that had the biggest impact on me were careful about saying what I needed to hear at different times, as far as sometimes students really need encouragement, and other times what students need is some tough love and a dose of reality. So I think when I'm teaching, I'm always trying to figure out, what does the student need to hear today to have the best results in a week and in a month? And sometimes it is that you need to be tough, and other times they just need, you have to tell them things are okay. You're going to be okay. Believe in yourself and all of that. And the last thing that I want to add actually comes from my dad. Happy Father's Day, Dad. My dad was a chemical engineer, not a musician or really musical person at all. But he would always be a mentor to like younger people working in his company. And he would always tell me that people will generally rise to the expectations that you set for them, whether they're low or whether they're high in the sky beyond what they think is capable. And that's something I always try to keep in mind too. Don't set expectations too low for students, because then they don't necessarily believe they're capable of more.
Karli,
Wow,
great,
very cool.
great stuff.
That's great.
Yeah, well, two things. One, Karli, that last thing reminded me. I think I've probably told this story several times even before. But when we were at Miami, Karli was playing the Anna Ignatowicz Passacaglia, and Karli, you played the vibraphone part, right?
Vibraphone, yeah.
Yeah, which was the part that Svet played. So like in their coachings, it was like, oh, here, let me show you how this part goes, and be like Svet playing with this Polish girl Maria that could play anything, and it was like Karli's like, okay. But I remember Karli was coming, fresh off Boston Conservatory, studying with Nancy Zeltzman, and didn't memorize. Like that wasn't, a part of her vocabulary really. And Svet told her basically like, you're gonna memorize this, and you're gonna have this done by next week. And I remember Karli and I like talking, and she was just kind of like, I can't do that. And then she did. And like Stuart Saunders Smith, songs 1 through 9, like, you're going to memorize this. Like, I can't do that. And then she did. So yeah, I think the setting expectations thing is huge. But then I was going to add one thing. Are you guys familiar with the John Cage 10 rules for students and teachers?
No?
Yeah.
It's this, I think it was John Cage and Merce Cunningham developed this together. But I think you can boil it down to three rules. There's 10 rules total. You can Google and read them all if you want. But rule 2 is general duties as a student. Pull everything out of your teacher. Pull everything out of your fellow students. Rule 3 is general duties as a teacher. Pull everything out of your students. And rule number 7 is the only rule is work. If you work, it will lead to something. It is the people who do all the work all the time who eventually catch on to things. I have these John Cage rules actually on my door outside my office. But yeah, I think it's all like really good stuff. And I think one thing that touches on is like pulling stuff out of your fellow students is really big. And I certainly learned a lot from my fellow students, Karli included, quite a bit from Karli, in fact, and studies. So yeah.
Cool. Casey, do you have a sound for us today?
I do. Yeah, we can do my sound. Sure. So you guys have probably seen stuff like that before, right? Hopefully you all heard a little drum groove. Mm-hmm. So I was inspired a little bit by our conversation with Bob McCormick, and we were talking to him about Harry Partch. And of course, Harry Partch, famous composer for inventing all these new percussion instruments and all these new sounds. And a topic we kind of got into was like, is the race for the exploring of new sounds kind of like, is it over? It's probably not over, but it has at least like died down a little bit. And something I was saying, something Mark Applebaum has said before, which is like, there's so many sounds. And Mark Applebaum says, I'm so tired of sounds. And I personally am not tired of sounds, but there are so many, and they're so easy to come by now that we're in the digital age. So I was thinking of that conversation, and also thinking of a question I often get. You know, some of you might know I compose and I'll write pieces with tape playback, and students will often ask, like, well, how do you write these tape playback pieces? And it's interesting that, the more tools that appear every day on the store shelves, like synthesizers and MIDI sequencers and this step sequencer you're looking at here, it's like the more of these there are, actually the easier it makes to do these things, but the more confusing it can be to know where to start. So I thought I'd work on this little demonstration, maybe for future clinics or something, of what I'm going to call a one sample drum set. So this whole thing you're listening to, it's totally created by just this sound, just that little mouth smack. So of course I sampled that sound and then edited that one sound and then put it into this little step sequencer, and that's what you get. So, and now that you hear the sound, you might recognize that that's in there. So to some of our listeners, I'm sure this is going to be like, oh yeah, no duh, this is kind of basic. But again, I think it is basic, but it's also fairly difficult to, again, know where to start. So I'm going to walk you through just a little bit how to do it. So the first thing you're going to do is find some sound source. So you'll have to record something. And I made the same thing with a finger cymbal. So here is a little finger cymbal recording. Okay, so there you have, of course, the little waveform, the finger cymbal, and here it is one more time. Okay, then you'll need to edit or trim that. I'm going to shorten it to make it more like the length and function of like a hi-hat. So here I am trimming it. Pull the little waveform back so that the sound is short. Right, the goal here is not to make it sound like a hi-hat, but just make it like function like a hi-hat. So on and so forth. You continue to edit until you've got the sounds that you want, and you may end up with something a little like this. Here's my finger cymbal drum set. And what I figured out is if you continue to edit, you can actually really make the sound like actual hi-hat, actual bass drum, actual snare drum, if you're willing to take the time. This is just literally a few minutes of work worth for this. And if you have all the tools at your fingertips, ability to record, ability to sample and edit, and then ability to put in some kind of sequencer like that, it will literally take you minutes to do. So again, just kind of demonstrating just how abundantly easy it is to manipulate sound now, and just how much, how simple it can be. Here's a few others I made. I made one with what is this? Oh, that's the one you've already heard. Sorry. Let me try one more. This is more of the mouth sound. Yeah, so this got me thinking just a little bit about sampling and just what it is, because again, it's like so easy to do now. You kind of forget where it came from and what it does. So composer Pierre Schaeffer is kind of considered the father of sampling, as one article refers to him. And if you really want to read about this, check out www.factmag.com, and the article is called "A Guide to Pierre Schaeffer, the Godfather of Sampling." So of course he's doing this mostly in the 1940s and doing a lot of the same procedures that I just kind of demoed for you, but doing it with, of course, analog tape. I talked before about Varese and how he did a lot of these similar things, and also Delia Derbyshire and Daphne Oram, and a lot of composers working with analog tape. And Schaeffer is considered one of these early pioneers. So just a few things about him, and from this article that I liked, straight from the article, it says, Schaeffer, who had participated in the French resistance, once reflected, quote, "After the war, in the 45 to 48 period, we had driven back the German invasion, but we hadn't driven back the invasion of Austrian music, the 12-tone music." Continuing on, he says, "We had liberated ourselves politically, but music was still under the occupying foreign power, the music of the Vienna school." The article continues and says about Schaeffer, "Dissatisfied with the state of the music at the time, Schaeffer sought to create a new musical language which divorced sounds from their sources, thereby reducing music to the act of hearing alone, which he calls reduced listening. For example, take a field recording of a train moving along its tracks. At face value, you'd simply note the sound of a train Beyond that realization, listeners wouldn't give it much more thought. Schaeffer, however, realized there was a rich vein of musicality hidden within the seemingly mundane sound, snippets of complex rhythm, unique timbral characteristics, tonal peculiarities, strange and interesting textures. Our perception of these qualities, he recognized, was hindered by the associations and references that the sounds inherently carry. And this sentence resonates with me so much because I've said before, I really feel like a lot of times we hear music and we can't help associate the sounds with things we've been trained to associate it with, primarily by, I would say, film scores. You hear a flute do a little ditty and you immediately think of like a sound effect or of like what that would be visually highlighting, when really that little flute ditty or whatever might have some specific musical function to the development of the form or whatever, and you kind of can't really disassociate yourself from that. But that is his reduced listening explained. So the trick was to find and hide the association in order to bring the musical qualities of those sounds to the forefront. He discovered that he could modify and transform field recordings through the manipulation of turntables, acetate records, filters, and magnetic tape, thereby rendering the original context form and ultimately their source unrecognizable. And this I thought was really fun to experiment with and show that, like, yeah, you can take this and tweak it and play with it, do a little pitch correction, and even leave in the original sound. Like a lot of that in there, one of the voices was the original sound, and people won't really recognize it for what it was. Without these techniques, the history of music production, particularly hip-hop and electronic music, would look vastly different. As one of his students, Jean-Michel Jarry, a former student of Schaeffer's, put in 2007, quote, back in the 40s, Schaeffer invented the sample, the locked groove, in other words, the loop. It was Schaeffer who experimented with distorting sounds, playing them backwards, speeding them up, slowing them down. He was the one who invented the entire way music is made these days, which I don't think that's true. I still listen to like bands. I don't think Paul McCartney uses loop machines and stuff like that.
But I mean, the Beatles were, definitely following these footsteps with all their recording stuff.
Yeah, sure. Like definitely a lot of innovative things, and definitely like tons of music is made this way now. And sampling is, of course, very useful and very common. In fact, I saw a video of Ashley using a drum machine, drum trigger to trigger some sounds in one of her videos. So yeah, I mean, we certainly see that a lot. So anyway, I thought I'd just give you guys this little demo of sampling and little sequencer, and yeah, just to kind of further that conversation we were having with our buddy Bob McCormick.
I think that's really cool, and I actually think sampling and loops and pre-recorded tracks are very much commonplace, especially in contemporary theater. Not just, we usually think of sampling, we think of hip hop, but more and more in the theater world, you're playing someone, usually the drummer or the music director is controlling a variety of tracks for every song through Ableton. So I think it's actually really important for young musicians to try to take a music technology course. If you can't do it through school, maybe you could go to like a free classic guitar center or look up something on YouTube. But I think it's really important nowadays to have like a fundamental understanding of how music software works.
I completely agree.
And almost every show I'm playing these days has an electronic component, usually the Roland SPD SX. For example, on my Grinch tour, I have a full acoustic drum set up, acoustic timpani, and some auxiliary percussion, but I have about 20 different patches on an SPD that's like orchestral percussion. And before I was hired for that tour, I'd been using the sampler pad with Pitch Black, so I had a pretty good understanding of how it works. But I feel like if I hadn't had that knowledge, I would have been struggling to figure out how to make it work while I'm playing the show. So I would encourage everybody to at least have some rudimentary knowledge of electronics as a percussionist.
And I completely agree, and would also add, if you can't find a class, don't use that as the excuse. You can just start tinkering around, download Audacity for free, start using your microphone on your phone. I feel like a lot of times people will find excuses not to do it, and just start toying around with it. You will learn so much just by I wonder if I can make my own recording of clapping music where I clap both parts. So yes, you absolutely can, and it'll be a little bit of a struggle to try to do that, but you will learn so much along the way trying. You will learn so much about everything.
Cool. Well, thanks for the topic, Casey. That was great.
Yeah, sure.
Ashley, changing gears a little bit, I was wondering if you would talk a little bit more about what it's like to play and to make a living in New York. And you mentioned at one point practicing in your studio. It's something some of us, in a house, or even I live in an apartment, but I practice at home. We don't always have to think about, just the logistics. Where are you practicing? Would you talk about that a bit?
Yeah, sure. It's definitely a challenge to be a percussionist in a city that is mostly apartment living. I've been fortunate that in the past I've lived in a few places where I have been able to have my drum set up, maybe with mesh heads on to try to keep the volume down. But even in those instances, I had an outside studio space because for me personally, I practice better when I'm not in my home living space. Because I'm home, I get distracted by my cat, or, oh my gosh, that mail I haven't opened in a month. This seems like a good time to open it instead of practicing these xylophone licks, So it's been better for me to go to an outside space. But that is, you hear that New York City is expensive, and that is definitely another expense. It can be expensive to rent. I mean, I think the most I ever paid for a rental space was like $300 a month, which is pretty expensive, but it came with every percussion instrument that I needed to play. There was a 5-octave there was timpani, there was drum set up. Right now in my space, it's pretty much just equipped for drum set, or it's a big enough space that I can have rehearsals in there and teach lessons, which is nice. But yeah, you don't want to get into a noise battle with your neighbors. So yeah, I feel like if you're not in school or teaching at a school in New York, you pretty much have to have an outside rehearsal space.
One more question. This can be a tricky one for us sometimes to talk about with a lot of nuance, but I wanted to ask you about your experience as a female percussionist, and maybe if there's anything you want to share about being a female percussionist with regards to what you've experienced.
Great question. When I was first starting out drumming, the only female drummer that I really knew that existed was Cindy Blackman. And I only knew of her because she was in a Lenny Kravitz music video. And I heard a lot growing up, oh, you're pretty good for a girl. Or, oh, it's interesting that you're a girl and you play the drums. It's like a guy's instrument. What's it like? And obviously, I feel like especially in the last decade, female representation has been more in the forefront, not just in drumming, but in, musical theater, sports, anything. And I think it's great because it's really important for young kids to have someone to look up to that they can relate to. Whether you're a female drummer or a person of color, it's really important to have role models that you can relate to, not just like your standard old white guy. So I would encourage professionals who are minorities to do as much outreach as possible, be as visible as possible, just because even if people aren't reaching out to you, you know that you're there for people to look up to. And I will say that drums are for everybody. You don't have to be a man to play them, but it is an instrument where you have to be okay with like kind of getting dirty and like doing heavy lifting. So you have to be strong. If you're a lady, like do some sorry. Be strong, exercise, take care of your body. You're gonna have to carry your drums around. When you start drumming, like when I started at least, it was with the practice pad. I didn't realize that in 20 years, I'm not just taking my practice pad to a gig. I have to get my entire drum set there, down 3 flights of stairs, into the car, at the venue, up 3 flights of stairs. So you have to be willing to be physical. It's a very physical instrument. So in that instance, it's not for everybody, but it's not just not for women. Some men that wouldn't jive with them either. So it's physical. It's very demanding, and it's really important to take care of your body. Which the older I get, the more I'm aware of the little issues with my body. So like when I was in Miami with Karli, I was experiencing a little bit of tendonitis for the first time in my life. So I was completely freaked out about it, but I went to like a physical therapist. I got some acupuncture, chiropractor. They taught me some exercises, some stretches to do, and I've been able to keep those issues at bay. But you really have to take care of your body starting when you're young.
Well, this is one other thing, like you were mentioning earlier, sometimes we're not ready for the advice that we're getting, or sometimes it takes longer to sink in. Similarly,
Yeah.
like, we all know that stretching is important, but when I was younger, I didn't always stretch and do like a full warm up, like especially starting gentler, warming up every time I play. There are times, I got to jump in, I'm learning notes, I have a lot to do. And you imagine that that's more efficient, but in the long run, you have to take care of your body.
Exactly.
Yeah. Casey, I think you have something.
Well, yeah, thanks so much for sharing. Like, love what you said. I just recently kind of have been following this, man, like I guess it's an old debate, but maybe I'm just figuring it out. But it's with athletics and talking about transgender people in different sports, and like, oh man, like it is a really fascinating argument, and it's really complicated, and I'm like no one to speak about it. But listening to the argument, it does make me think like, oh man, I'm so glad that drumming, there's nothing that like men can do that women can't. Like there's just nothing, like I think of the hardest licks ever played. I've seen Momoko Kamiya play stuff that I can never play. And it's like I think about all of that, and like, man, like I'm like a pretty scrawny dude, and like I can do I think a lot. It's just like, oh man, I'm so glad we don't have to do that. I feel like music is a really very equal opportunity sport, luckily.
Yeah, it can be for sure. It's important to be cognizant of who, if you're like a musical contractor, to be cognizant of who you're hiring.
Sure.
Obviously, you want to hire the best people for the job, but there's definitely women out there that would be the best for the job, or non-binary identifying people who would be best for the job, or people of color. So I think it's really important to not just hire the people that look like you, but to have a good representation all around.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah, and like you said, I think we're seeing trends towards that. everywhere in society in the last 5 years and 10 years. And that's amazingly positive, I think, for the future and where we're all going.
Yeah, and I guess I mean equal opportunity as in like just like the physicality of it, you know, like is not there's I mean performance wise, oh yeah, we can all do what each other can do, you know. But yeah, you're absolutely right as far as like the opportunities, yeah, make sure they're equally available to everyone and yeah, be very aware of who you choose to program and yeah, try to be aware of those things. It's really good thing.
And also please try to play repertoire written by minorities. I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, of course. You know, recently I just saw Mallet Lab is down here in Florida. I don't know if you guys are familiar with it, but they were doing a call for scores specifically for female composers, and I think that's hugely important. I've seen some articles circulating recently, like talking about the ratios of male to female composers performed by major orchestras, and we're nowhere near 50-50, not even close.
Yeah.
One orchestra performed Jennifer Higdon this year, like one.
Right.
Right?
No, I mean I've seen statistics like that. I mean it's crazy, and like
Yeah, I think
orchestras will like seriously will have like, oh yeah, we kind of accidentally programmed a Libby Larson piece. How about that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think I won't name the name of the orchestra, but it's a very one of the best, and they're in the Midwest. And 2 or 3 years ago, I think they programmed one work by a woman for their entire season, and they saw an extreme amount of backlash about that.
I think I remember what you're talking about. One that pops into my mind, not an orchestra, but have you guys heard the controversy about the Phantom Regiment drum corps show this year?
No.
They're doing a show based around Joan of Arc, who is obviously like a huge like historical female, you know, figure, and all male composers.
Yep.
And like they said, the director of the corps or whatever actually wrote like a very what's the word I'm looking for? I can't think of the word. Very good, for lack of a better word, response to the criticism. And basically he said, you know, we had, you know, design meetings and it was a huge mistake. It never occurred to us. Like we selected things that we thought would showcase like the power of Joan of Arc, that sort of thing. And yes, we absolutely should have taken into consideration female composers and should have tried to get female composers, but he basically said, like, my apologies, we did not, and we'll never make this mistake again. And I mean, to his credit, I think it's probably too late in the game to rework that in some way. So yeah, but that's a big one that just came up.
Well, I think awareness is so important, and just all these conversations that we're having, keep having them, and keep bringing these points to a head of let's be aware of inequities and what can we do to fix them. What can we do to make things more equal? It's tough, Ashley. I don't know if you feel this way. I've gotten comments like you said, like, "Oh wow, you're a percussionist. That's so cool. Like you're a female. Wow,
you're a girl, and you're
and you play drums." You know, and I've always thought like I don't want people to think it's so cool that I'm a female percussionist. Like you can just think it's so cool that I'm a good percussionist. Like
right, like I'm also just good, you know.
Yeah, like I'd rather be recognized as for accomplishing things or for performing rather than like, wow, it's so cool you're a girl.
Yeah, like there was the Gary Burton in his Gary Burton in his autobiography talks about like I didn't want to be known as, you know, like the gay vibes player. Like I wanted to be known as a vibraphone player that happened to be gay, and I think that's pretty like profound statement there.
Well, and Evelyn Glennie says that too. Like, I don't want to be famous for being a deaf percussionist. I want to be famous for just being a really good percussionist, you know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, all right. Ashley, thank you so much for sharing so much with us today.
Of course.
I loved so much of what you said. It was great to have you on. Hopefully we'll talk with you soon.
Yeah. Thank you guys so much for having me.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. Congratulations on all you're doing.
Keep up the great podcast. Keep it coming.
Hey, thanks.
Betcha.
All right. Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye-bye.
Bye.